On my wedding day, my sister smiled as she ruined my life. In front of hundreds of people, she tore my happiness apart. But what she didn't know was that I would make her regret every single second of it. The morning of my wedding felt like a dream, the kind of dream you never want to wake up from. The house was buzzing with life, the air filled with the scent of roses and jasmine. Everywhere I turned, people were smiling, hugging, congratulating. My mother's eyes shone with pride, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had everything I had ever prayed for. My gown sparkled under the golden lights. Layers of silk flowed like water around me, and as I walked through the hall, all eyes followed. The chandeliers glimmered above, casting me in a glow I thought I deserved. The sound of laughter, music, and whispered blessings wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I told myself, this is it. This is my new beginning. But sometimes beginnings come dressed as endings. The ceremony began. The priest cleared his throat, and the guests settled into silence. I could feel my heart racing, pounding like drums in my chest. And then, almost too faint to notice at first, I caught it. The murmur of whispers. It started in the back row. One person leaned over to another. A laugh broke through the silence. Then another. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my focus on the man standing beside me, the one who was supposed to be my future. But soon, the whispers grew louder, heavier, like a storm rolling in. Phones lit up across the room. Screens glowed in the darkness. I could see the faces of my guests shifting. First confusion, then shock, then disgust. Their eyes darted toward me, stabbing me with judgment I didn't understand. And then, chaos. I heard someone gasp. Someone else shouted. My body froze as I realized what had happened. A secret. A private truth I had buried deep inside myself was suddenly out in the open. My life, my dignity, had been torn apart in front of hundreds of people. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. I lifted my eyes, desperate to understand. And there across the hall I saw her. My sister, my own blood. She wasn't horrified like the rest. She wasn't broken for me. She was smiling like a predator who had finally trapped its prey. I wanted to scream, to collapse, to vanish into the ground. But my body betrayed me. My feet locked to the floor. My throat closed up. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then I felt it, the shift in energy beside me. My fiancé, the man who had promised to stand by me. His expression hardened, his body stiffened, and when I looked into his eyes, all I found was disgust. His family mirrored his face. Their eyes turned to knives. The love and acceptance I thought I had won evaporated in a single moment. The whispers turned to laughter. The laughter turned to judgment. And I stood there, trapped in the center of the storm, as my world collapsed around me. The wedding, the one I had dreamed about since I was a child, was over before it could even begin. And it was my sister who ended it. The shame was unbearable. My chest ached as if the air had been ripped from my lungs. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't carry me. I wanted to fight back, but my voice was gone. In that hall, with the music silenced and the laughter echoing, I drowned. That day, something inside me died. The hopeful bride. The woman who believed in love, in family, in sisterhood, she was buried right there, under the weight of betrayal. But death is never just an ending. Sometimes, when something dies inside you, something else is born. And as I stood there in the ashes of my broken future, staring at my sister's wicked smile, I felt it awaken. Not hope, not forgiveness, but fire. That day, I lost everything I thought I wanted. But I gained something I didn't know I needed. A reason to rise again. A reason to destroy. A reason. For revenge. When the dust settled and the guests left in shocked clusters, the truth spread faster than any rumor could. It wasn't a leak from an anonymous account or some stranger's gossip. It was deliberate. Surgical. Someone had wanted my life torn open and scattered so everyone could step on it. Later, in the silence of my empty room, I replayed everything. The way the phones lit up like tiny lanterns of accusation. The way my father's jaw clenched and my mother's hands trembled. The way my soon-to-be husband's eyes shifted, not with concern but with calculation. It felt like watching a slow, meticulous execution, while everyone else smiled at the spectacle. And then I remembered the smile across the hall, the one I'd mistaken for concern, only to find it was satisfaction. My sister. Up until that day, I had trusted her with the small things: secrets, childhood fights, late-night worries. I had believed that blood meant loyalty. I had been naive. Why would she do it? The answers came like splinters: jealousy, resentment, a lifetime of small slights she had folded into a weapon. Maybe she envied the way I moved through the world, how people opened doors for me, how I found love easier than she did. Maybe she resented the way our parents praised my choices and ignored hers. Or maybe, more dangerous still, she had always been the kind of woman who measured her power by other people's pain. She didn't just expose a secret. She set a trap. It was deliberate humiliation, timing, audience, delivery, all chosen to maximize the fallout. She knew exactly how fragile the things I treasured were. She knew which strings to pull so they would snap in public. That realization dug a new kind of wound because it meant this was personal. This was an attack designed to ruin me, my reputation, my future, my family ties. The town told stories about sisters who competed, sisters who fought for scraps of attention. But I had never thought my sister would become a storyteller of my downfall. She rewrote our history in one cruel afternoon, painted me as reckless, immoral, unreliable. She took my private sorrow and turned it into a weapon against me. And the worst part, she did it with ease, as if erasing me was the only way to scratch her hunger. I tried to confront her later, but her voice was composed, her eyes dry, her words wrapped in a false civility. She wore innocence like armor. "I only told the truth," she said. "You should have been honest." Her tone was a scalpel disguised as a sermon. She wanted me to feel guilt for being the victim. That was her art: to flip damage into confession, to make the wounded feel responsible. But you don't become a predator overnight. I began to map the months before, the subtle nudges, the conversations she steered, the people she flattered into alignment. It was cold to see the pattern, how someone close could assemble allies, precondition witnesses, and prepare the stage. The betrayal was not a single moment, it was a campaign, and I had been the target. Betrayal changes the way you see every familiar face. You start to catalog casual smiles you once loved and ask which ones are genuine. You learn to read small silences as weapons, to measure professions of love as possible lies. Trust becomes a currency you can no longer afford to spend. In the weeks after, while the town buzzed with whispers and my phone screen filled with messages of pity and accusation, I felt something else settle into me, a schematic. The betrayal had left a blueprint. It showed me exactly how she operated, her habits, her vulnerabilities, her arrogance. She had thought her betrayal would scatter me forever, but all it did was lay out her seams. I remember sitting by the window and watching her go about her life. The same grocery runs, the same coffee orders, the same casual laugh that had once felt like family music. Now I watched it like a spy watching a target. Every ordinary detail had become a piece of intelligence. Her vanity, her need for approval, the way she cut corners to save face. These were not just flaws. They were openings. The fire inside me stopped being only pain. It cooled into calculation. Betrayal had lit the match. Understanding how she burned me taught me how to control the flame. I would not respond with the chaos that had been inflicted upon me. I would respond with precision. There would be no public meltdowns, no childish revenge. I would dismantle her life the way she had dismantled mine, methodically, painfully, and in plain daylight so everyone could see how a sister's kindness had been faked for years. I would mirror her cruelty back at her, but sharpened, because she needed to feel the slow erosion of everything she thought secure. And as the late nights stretched into plans and lists and whispered surveillance of her routines, I told myself the lie that keeps the wrongs warm. This is justice. This is balance. But under the lie, the truth murmured, revenge always changes the avenger. Still, in that hollow after the betrayal, revenge felt like the only medicine. The betrayal had been surgical. My response would be an operation of its own. Piece by piece, I would take back the life she stole. Piece by piece, I would make her understand the flavor of ruin, because betrayal taught me one indelible lesson: never confuse blood for refuge. Sometimes your enemy is the one who knows you best. For days, I lived like a ghost. The town had moved on in whispers and side glances. My house felt enormous and emptied of meaning. Meals were noise, faces were shadows, and even the light through the curtains seemed to mock me, thin and indifferent. I tried to sleep and found only a pounding pulse that echoed the way my world had been dismantled. I tried to speak, and the words clotted in my throat like coagulated blood. Grief became a constant companion until grief hardened into something else. One night, alone in the silence of my room, I sat in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same eyes, the same cheekbones, but her gaze was hollowed by a new edge. The tear tracks had dried into salt lines on her face, and her wedding makeup still clung to the creases of her skin like a bad memory. In that reflected face, I saw more than loss. I saw an instrument. I saw a subject capable of a different life. The innocent girl who had walked down the aisle earlier that week had been buried. In her stead, a new face was forming. Careful, cold, precise. I realized with a clarity that felt like iron that pity was not a plan. Sympathy would not rebuild what had been stolen. All the consolations, "It wasn't your fault, you'll find love again," were soft bandages on a wound that needed surgery. And so I made a decision that felt at once obscene and inevitable. I would stop being a victim. I would become something else entirely. It was not a decision born of rage alone. Rage is noisy. Revenge is quiet. I let my anger settle into a discipline. I began to catalog everything: names, dates, offhand remarks, the faces in the crowd that had nodded when my life was exposed. I mapped relationships like a cartographer mapping a city in ruins: who fed gossip, who followed whom, who would crack under pressure. Betrayal had given me a blueprint, and I studied it until the architecture of her life made sense. Then I trained. Not with weights or weapons, but with edges that cut in subtler ways. I polished my voice into a weapon of composure. I learned to smile without meaning it, to ask questions that seemed casual but were surgical. I read contracts, I read social media protocols, I learned the language of reputation and leverage. Every skill was a tool. Every tool served a future aim. I practiced patience until it was indistinguishable from resolve. I started small, harmless recalibrations that felt like proof that I could control. I returned calls I had ignored before. I made polite appearances where I knew eyes would be present. I bought a new journal and filled it with observations, not grief. Each entry was a promise. Remember. Record, wait. The more ordinary these acts, the better. No one suspected that normalcy was rehearsal. There were nights when doubt gnawed like an animal at the edges. Would I become the person I despised? Would the long hunger for payback hollow me? Those questions hovered like moths, but I shut the door on them. I knew the only way forward was to accept that the line between justice and vengeance would blur. I also knew something else. If I did nothing, I would die under the weight of what had been taken. So I began to build strategies for humiliation that mirrored the one done to me, but smarter, more surgical. I would not scream at the top of the stairs. I would whisper into the right ears. I would not break doors. I would close them softly behind her, one by one, until her world was quietly unlivable. If she wanted spectacle, I would give her the slow burn. If she sought power in exposure, I would strip her of the foundations that made exposure possible. There were practical steps, too. I created false confidences, seeded doubts among allies, and learned where her pride lived, what names she wouldn't let anyone speak badly of, what achievements she'd die to preserve. Pride has fractures. I planned to find them. In private, I arranged details no one would notice until they mattered. A misplaced file, a timed message, a casual mention that tipped a balance. The aim was methodical, not malicious chaos. I wanted her to feel the erosion, to watch her own life unravel like a thread pulled through fingers. Most nights, when the house finally settled and the moon tracked thinly across the floorboards, I would rehearse the shape of what I'd do. I imagined standing in a room where she had once held sway, and seeing that same look of sick triumph mirrored back at her, then watching it curdle. I imagined the cold satisfaction of measures taken carefully, of debts accounted for. But even as I measured and planned, I felt the smallest part of me plead for something else: softness, forgiveness, a return to ordinariness. I heard that voice like a distant bell, and then I pressed it down. Mercy would be a luxury I could not afford, at least not yet. The night I finally decided my path for good, I burned the wedding invitation. The paper turned, curled, and then blackened, and the flames took the name of the man who had stood beside me and the date I had once dreamed about. It was a small, private funeral. I watched the ash drift and told myself aloud what I had decided. I will not be remembered as the woman who bowed to shame. I will be remembered as the one who took back what was hers. So I rose from that chair, hands steady, heart lit with a cold, clean fire. Not vengeance for vengeance's sake, but reclamation. The bait had been set, and I would draw the line with care. The world had watched me fall. Now it would watch her fall instead. And with that, my life narrowed to a single, precise objective. Take back everything, no matter what it cost. Revenge is not a single shout. It's a long, patient whisper that gathers force until it becomes a storm. I learned that. Very quickly. If she had engineered my ruin with precision, then precision was exactly what I would answer with. No theatrics. No frantic scenes. Just a steady, methodical dismantling, one loose tile at a time until the whole floor gave way beneath her. First, I rebuilt my exterior. I stopped wearing grief like a badge. I started showing up. Small, public, controlled appearances where people could see me composed, unbroken. A charity brunch. A mutual friend's birthday. I let the town catch glimpses of the woman they had tried to bury, now moving with purpose instead of shame. These were not reconciliations. They were placements. Strategic signals that I was back in circulation and that my presence mattered. Then I turned to the more delicate work. Her relationships. People are mazes with maps drawn in their habits. I watched how she liked to be flattered, who she trusted with jokes, which colleagues would go silent when confronted with scandal. I fed tiny uncertainties into those spaces, an offhand comment here, a question raised in private there. Never a direct accusation. Suggestion is a more lethal tool than rage because suggestion allows others to finish the lie on their own. Jealous friends began to notice small contradictions. Allies started to hesitate. The first cracks were invisible to everyone but me, but they grew. Her career was next. She had built her reputation on competence and polish, and reputations are brittle when someone scratches their surface. I highlighted inconsistencies in her work, publicly but carefully. A delayed email, a forgotten meeting, a misattributed quote. I made sure these moments stacked. One error doesn't define a person. A pattern does. Sponsors paused. Invitations dried up. Those who had once admired her professionalism began to question if she had ever been that person at all. I also learned the power of timing. The same revelation delivered at noon barely ripples. Delivered when a sponsor is signing a contract or when a family is watching, it detonates. So I timed disclosures to maximize consequence. An accusation whispered before a board vote. A rumor seeded just when a relationship was fragile. It was surgical cruelty. I watched as the things she controlled slipped beyond her fingers, but the most delicious part was watching her social currency evaporate. Friends she'd used like trophies began to distance themselves. People who once posted her glamorous photos replaced them with silence. Reciprocity, likes, invites, favors, withered. Social death arrives slowly and looks ordinary. Fewer messages, fewer coffee dates, a voicemail machine that never lights up. That ordinary neglect felt like a public execution. There were nights I walked past places we both frequented, cafes where she laughed too loudly, a gym where she strutted confidence, and I kept my face neutral. I logged everything. Names of new allies, the date someone stepped away, the small misdemeanor that could be magnified. I was not cruel without cause. I was surgical with intent. Every move was a reaction calibrated to mirror the humiliation she had inflicted on me. I also used the one weapon she never suspected, empathy as camouflage. I reached out with gentle concern when she stumbled publicly, offering support that felt real enough to lower her guard. A private message, a call that sounded like sisterly advice. When she accepted it, she handed me access. I listened. People confess when they think a confidant is neutral. And confidences are raw material. Secrets make the skeleton of a person's life. Reveal the wrong bone and their structure collapses. There were moral checks, nights when the plan felt monstrous. I would lie awake and imagine her in pieces and wonder if I had simply swapped one wound for another. But the memory of her smile at my ruin hardened my resolve. Anger makes you messy. Calculation keeps you winning. I chose calculation. As the months passed, the pattern emerged. Her public missteps grew, her friends thinned, her lovers cooled. She learned to apologize in ways that sounded rehearsed. She began to look smaller in photographs, shoulders tight, laughter brittle. Once, I watched her stand in front of a mirror, touching a place where her confidence used to live, and I felt no triumph. Only the slow, clinical satisfaction of a job executed exactly as planned. People asked why she was falling apart. Some blamed fate, others blamed her. The truth, that a sister had orchestrated the collapse, was hidden behind a curtain of plausible deniability I had built. I wanted the world to understand the consequence of betrayal without seeing the hand that drew the line. Let the audience complete the story in their heads. Humans are quick to believe narrative when the evidence fits. There were risks. A misstep meant exposure. A sudden display of pity could be read as guilt. I navigated both with extreme caution. Every rumor I seeded had plausible sources. Every misplacement of information was designed to look accidental. I learned to be invisible when I needed to be, and to appear at the perfect moment to nudge a suspicion into action. By the time the damage was undeniable, I had already planned the next moves. The slow burn had become an inferno focused on her. She had made my life consumable theater. I returned the favor, but silent, smart, irreversible. The revenge was no longer just retribution. It had become a lesson written in the margins of her life. A demonstration, do not mistake family for refuge. And still, under the satisfaction, something soft stirred. Something I had buried in favor of precision. I kept it there, folded like a secret, because I knew that once you cross this line, there is no clean return. The world would whisper about her downfall, but it would also whisper about me. That was the price I had decided to pay. Piece by piece, I was taking everything back. Piece by piece, I was teaching her the cost of betrayal. There is a moment in any carefully planned operation when the pieces stop feeling like separate acts and start to form a shape that cannot be ignored. For me, that moment arrived the day I decided to pull the last thread. I had stoked her life with small fires, rumors, doubts, missed opportunities, and watched it smolder. Now it was time to strike where it would hurt the most, expose the secret she had clung to like a life preserver, the one thing she believed would protect her from ruin. I chose the setting coldly. A gala she'd spent months preparing for, an evening full of faces who mattered. Sponsors, old friends, the very people whose applause once fed her. The room glittered with possibility, and that made it perfect. People come to galas to be seen. They come to be reassured that the social order holds. I wanted that order to break in front of them. The lead-up was invisible to everyone but me. I had shuffled emails, arranged a misplaced file, and nudged a journalist who owed me a favor. Each small action was camouflage. She arrived that night in a gown she had chosen for impact, her smile measured and ready. She moved through the crowd the way predators move, confident, practiced, hungry for approval. I watched her from across the room, feeling the same cold precision that had kept me awake for months. Then, at the precise moment when the sympathetic applause would have cushioned any rumor, the lights shifted. I leaned into the microphone I'd been given under the pretense of giving a short speech. My voice was steady, not shouting, not pleading, just a quiet current that would carry an accusation further than any sensational headline. I spoke about truth. I spoke about honesty. I spoke in general terms that sounded almost like a sermon, and I watched heads turn, curious. And then I pulled the thread. I told a story, our story, but edited. I revealed details only a sister could know. The hidden ledger of favors, the late-night calls, the quiet arrangements that showed motive. I revealed the secret she had buried under veneers and compliments. I made it small enough to be plausible, large enough to be devastating. The room tilted. Conversation stopped. The polite clinking of glasses became a sound like distant waves. Her face changed first in ways I had rehearsed in my head. Confusion, then color draining, then the flash of panic as she counted her options and found none. She stumbled backward and the crowd closed like a curtain. People who had once wanted to be photographed with her moved away. A sponsor I'd targeted stood up, his smile gone. His expression schooled into the judgment I'd been arranging for months. She tried to speak. Words came out thin and defensive, but the momentum was against her. This was not a private shame to be hushed in corners. This was a public unmasking, and the public is a stern judge. I watched as friends I'd once envied looked at her and found reasons to look away. I watched as the architecture of her social life, the one she had built on careful performances, cracked. And when she finally found me, when her voice broke and she reached out with those words, "Why are you doing this to me?" I felt the whole plan encounter a human plea. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were a commodity of desperation. For a sliver of a second, I felt the old tug. The sister I had once known. The one who used to braid my hair, who defended me from neighborhood bullies. That memory landed like a stone in my chest. But I had rehearsed for this too. I remembered every hurt, every moment they had laughed when I'd fallen. I remembered the smell of the hall and the way her smile had looked when my life was stripped in public. I let her see my face, calm, resolved. I let her hear my voice, cold, precise. Because you taught me how, I said. You taught me the language of ruin. I only spoke it back. She fell apart in a way that was both final and terrifying. That night she begged, pleaded, clawed for whatever dignity she could salvage. But the world that mattered to her had already moved on. Opportunities evaporated. Messages went unanswered. Her apologies sounded like worn scripts. The sponsors rescinded. The friends who had once posed with her for glamorous posts replaced their portraits with silence. In public, she became a study in shrinking. When I walked away from that gala, the air felt different, thinner, sharper. I felt the weight of what I'd done settling into my bones. I had taken everything from her. I had made her taste the bitter, slow erosion I had experienced. I had given her no mercy because she had offered me none. But victory, when it finally arrives, is not the fireworks you imagine. It is small and quiet and full of echoes. In the days that followed, people would come up to me with nods, with murmurs of sympathy, turned to respect. Some would whisper that justice had been done. Others would look at me the same way they had looked at her, trying to measure what had changed. I listened to those murmurs, and they sounded like ash. In the hush after triumph, an uneasy question rose in me. Who was I now? Had I reclaimed myself, or had I remade myself into the very agony I had sworn to punish? The sister I had destroyed had been cruel, yes. But by the time the dust settled, I recognized that the version of me who orchestrated the ruin had operated in a cold, patient cruelty that left no room for softness. That night, I stood alone on the balcony of my empty apartment, the city lights small and indifferent below. I let the silence in. I had my victory, I had my retribution, and I had a quiet, private grief, the realization that in taking everything from her, I had paid for it with a piece of myself. Revenge had answered one question. Could I make her suffer as I had? The answer was yes, but it left another deeper question. What next? The cost had been counted. The price had been paid. What remained was whether I could live with that ledger balanced forever. And so I let the wind carry away the final embers and walked back inside. The shape of my life changed in ways I would spend years understanding. The stain of what I had done would follow me like a shadow that never fully fades.